The preceding program was brought to you in part by Welcome to this week's edition of the Pete Mezzetti Show. I'm Pete Mezzetti. It's actually history night tonight on the Pete Mezzetti Show, and if we're talking history, that must mean one thing. My buddy David Levasseur is back. Hello, sir.
Hello, sir.
How are you, bud?
I'm just fine as frog's hair split twice.
Exactly. What's new?
Not much.
No?
Keeping busy with history and
Well,
with the
good.
250th celebration that's being planned. So,
Cool. So where shall we start?
well, I'm going to start a little out of context. We left
boy.
off in 1777,
We did.
and I thought I would do a throwback for a very specific reason.
Okay.
Today is the exact 251st anniversary of Patrick Henry's famous speech to the Second Virginia Convention.
Really?
And I thought it would be kind of neat to start off with that because a lot of people know about the last line, but they don't know about the whole talk. Mm-hmm. And he was a 38-year-old lawyer. He attended the Virginia Convention, and the reason Virginia had a convention was their royal governor was still around, and he'd closed their House of Burgesses, which was their General Assembly.
Really?
So these guys had to meet on their own surreptitiously, and instead of meeting in Williamsburg, which was the capital, they met in Richmond. And their job was basically to figure out how to protest what was going on with England. And there were some who were moderates, there were some who were conservatives and weren't quite ready to make the split
Okay.
or even take up arms. And then there were some who saw clearly what was coming down the road.
Okay.
And among them was Patrick Henry. And my favorite part of his speech is the very end. He had already argued and proposed that Virginia beef up its militia system.
Okay.
Unlike New England, which had a robust militia system that had been used repeatedly in all these wars with the French and the Indians, Virginia really didn't have one. And of course, their governor had done nothing to make it robust because he was a loyalist. The last thing he wanted was a bunch of armed patriots running around with guns.
Yeah.
That could be not in his best interest.
Exactly.
So these guys meeting in Richmond were figuring out what to do, and Patrick Henry said, look, there's a war coming.
Right.
We know there's a war coming. It's just a question of when. And we need to get our militia in shape. So that was his proposal, but then the speech followed the proposal. And probably the most robust part of his speech was the ending where he says, gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. And the next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the resounding sound of conflict. What is it that gentlemen want? What is it they wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or liberty so sweet, so as to be purchased with the chains of slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others would take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And so everybody remembers the
Yes.
liberty or death part.
Yes.
But the rest is really a rolling procedure beforehand. And what I find fascinating is he talks about they'll get in the next wind the story of armed conflict coming from the north. Lexington and Concord happened less than a month later.
Okay.
So talk about being prescient and being able to see the future. Nobody did that like Patrick Henry,
Really?
who was also one of the greatest orators and trial attorneys in the colony of Virginia, both before the Revolution and after. So I start with that only because that's a great setting of the stage
Right.
for what we're going to talk about tonight.
Okay.
We talked about in the last show the battles of Saratoga and how important they were to bring the French into the war on our side.
Yes.
And at the same time that was going on, Washington was not doing so well defending the city of Philadelphia. We also talked in the very first show about the 5 largest cities in the colonies, which were, in order of size, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Charleston, South Carolina, and Newport, Rhode Island.
Okay.
During the course of the war, all 5 of these cities would be occupied by the British. And yet it brought them no closer to a victory, which shows a fundamental flaw in their strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Washington always focused on picking off British armies or parts of them, thereby reducing their ability to fight. The British concentrated on holding cities, thinking that that would change people's hearts and minds. And quite frankly, what it usually did was just steal people's resolve to not want to give in to the British. Because if they come in and are marching in and take over your town
Right.
and put troops in your house,
Right.
that's not very conducive to wanting to be loyal.
No.
So the British still had not abandoned that policy, and that's how they came to take Philadelphia. The Continental Congress ended up moving to York, Pennsylvania,
Okay.
where they spent a year and a half until the British left. And Washington and his troops, even though they'd fought well, retreated to a little valley called Valley Forge to spend the winter. Now this was interesting because this was the first year that Washington had an army that didn't go home at the end of the year. Because up until that point, he was completely dependent upon the militia system to raise troops. And the militia system, as we discussed in the past, raised troops. They came in the spring, they left in the fall.
Okay.
They never served more than a year. And it took extra legislation from each colony to authorize them to fight outside of that colony.
Ah.
So Washington desperately wanted an army that wouldn't evaporate at the end of the year, because the British had an army that didn't evaporate at the end of the year.
Right.
So if he was going to go toe-to-toe with them, he had to maintain an army like that.
Okay.
So be careful what you wish for.
Exactly.
He got an army. He had 12,000 men at Valley Forge. And the first thing he ran into is food. I've got to keep these guys fed.
Right.
I've got to come up with enough wood for them to burn and to build huts to live in.
Okay.
So he did both of those. It took a long time to get the food chain under control because of corruption and waste and a little bit of fraud in the supply system. But the other problem that he had is disease, and he couldn't do much about that because the men were packed into the huts so tightly that once one of them got sick, it just spread through the entire hut.
Gotcha.
So now he's got his army. He's nurturing them through the winter, but they're still not trained. They're militiamen. They may have signed up for 3 years or for the duration of the war, but that doesn't mean they were trained. There was no such thing as basic training back then.
No.
They didn't ship you off to Fort Bragg or Fort Dix to train how to be a soldier.
Exactly.
So these guys showed up and they were not trained, and their officers weren't much better, even the ones who had prior military experience in the French and Indian War. The English looked down on the colonials so much that they basically said to them, you handle the wood detail, you handle cleaning the latrines, you handle hauling supplies, we'll do the fighting. So these guys never got any military training during the French and Indian War.
Okay.
So Washington desperately needed somebody to train the troops
Okay.
as to how to fight.
Sure.
And fortunately for him, in February of 1778, a Prussian officer by the name of Wilhelm Friedrich von Steuben
Okay.
arrives at camp, and Washington makes him inspector general. And the first thing von Steuben does is start training the troops. And he starts with Washington's personal lifeguard group and trains them so he can use them to demonstrate as he trains the officers. And then the officers and their sergeants will go on and train the men.
Ah.
And so by the time springtime comes, he actually has an army that's trained how to march, how to fight like a European army, how to use a bayonet the way the British do.
Okay.
And they also have a rudimentary concept of tactics and strategy, all of which is important for a soldier in the line to know what his duty is, what his responsibilities are, and what his capabilities are. So the British finally end up leaving Philadelphia in the spring of 1778. And they decide to march back
Okay.
to New York City rather than take boats, which would take a lot of time to assemble and bring
Right.
to Philadelphia. So they start marching, and Washington comes up with this grand plan to attack their rear guard. Now, recently arrived in camp was the number 2 guy for the Continental Army, a gentleman by the name of Charles Lee, who was a strange fellow. He was originally an English officer who had settled in Virginia after he'd been passed over for promotion, and lived alone, was very happy raising horses and dogs, had a difficult personality. The problem with Lee was in late 1776, the British captured him.
Oh, no.
And so he was held prisoner in New York
Okay.
until early 1778 when he was released in exchange for another British officer who had been captured.
Oh, gotcha.
So he rejoins Washington's army, and he hasn't been around for a year and a half. So he has not seen Washington's brilliant exploits at Trenton and at Princeton. He hasn't seen Washington build a 3-year or duration of the war army.
Okay.
He hasn't seen them be trained. So he has no concept of the capabilities of the American army.
Right.
Nonetheless, as the next most senior officer after Washington, he asks permission to lead the attack on the British rear guard. He leads them, and it just becomes a disaster. Nobody's really sure what happened, except that commands broke down, communication broke down, and troops began retreating before they even were engaged with the enemy.
Right.
Washington finds out about this, and he's absolutely livid. So he comes onto the field, he confronts General Lee, and he actually strips him of his command in front of the troops and orders him to the rear. Washington then takes command, and believe it or not, the Americans do an incredible job fighting the British,
Oh, yeah.
and they actually drive the British from the field. And it's one of the best victories the Americans have during the war. And unfortunately, it ends up being the last major battle fought in the North. To bring it to a local level, we had at least one gentleman from the Clinton-Killingworth area who died at the Battle of Monmouth.
Really?
His name was Stephen Hall. We don't know how he died. The Battle of Monmouth was fought on a day that was so hot in June that they say the temperature was probably over 100 degrees.
Ooh.
And remember, in the 18th century, these guys fought in wool coats
Yeah.
and wool pants. And so, I mean, they're out there in the sun, maneuvering, charging, fighting, wearing all of this wool. And I don't have to tell you that of the American casualties and British casualties that day, a number of them were from heat stroke.
Yes.
So at that point, Mr. Hall, Private Hall dies. We win the battle. That's also where the legend of Molly Pitcher began, where Molly Pitcher followed her husband into the army. He serviced a cannon and an artillery unit. When he was wounded, she took over and served as a gunner on the cannon crew.
Really?
And has gone down in history as Molly Pitcher.
All right.
So we won that battle. The most important thing about 1778, other than the fact that the British left Philadelphia and went back to New York, was the French were now our allies. And the French and the British were foolish about this. When the British found out about the French alliance, the first thing they did was declare war on France. Now, France had not declared war on England. So had they just sat back and done nothing,
Right.
they would have been in less distress than they ended up being.
Mm-hmm.
But by declaring war on France, France now took the war to a whole new level.
Really?
People know that they sent troops and ships over here to help us. But what they don't know is that the revolution turned into a world war. And the British and the French fought in Africa. They fought in India. They fought in the Caribbean. When the Spanish came in, the Spanish fought in Florida, seizing British posts back. So what that means is when you've got to contend with fighting two other countries like France and Spain, you've got to shift your troops around, which means the British did not have the reinforcements that they needed in the American Revolution to send to America. They had to send them to all these other places in order to keep the French from taking India from them, from taking parts of Africa from them, from taking the Caribbean from them. So that had a decisive impact, not only because the French gave us troops and ships to help fight, but because their entry into the war drained off British soldiers that otherwise would have been sent here. So that's the fascinating thing about the French alliance that people don't talk about.
Okay.
The other thing is that, as I mentioned, that was the last major battle in the North. After all of this happened, the British decided to abandon Newport. They held on to New York, but they decided they would try to sway the southern states to stay loyal. And so they sent an army south. They sent several groups of armies south. In 1778, at the end, they seized Savannah, Georgia, and then they moved in and captured Augusta, Georgia. And then the following year, in 1780, they actually launched a large attack on Charleston, South Carolina, and captured it on May 12th of that year, trapping an entire American army of 5,000 men.
Holy cow.
So now these guys are out of the war. They've been captured. They've been paroled and sent home, but they're effectively no longer fighting units.
Right.
So Congress decided we needed to raise a new army, get a new commander, and send him south. Well, our old friend Horatio Gates from Saratoga, who had ridden that hobby horse in an incredible fashion, making him seem like he single-handedly won the battle. Right. And we know Benedict Arnold helped, other people helped, Daniel Morgan helped. He came in, he went over Washington's head and went directly to Congress and said, "Make me the commander." So they said, "Okay." And they sent him south, and he tried to pull together an army, and the British absolutely crushed them at the Battle of Camden. In fact, they crushed them so badly that Horatio Gates set a new land speed record.
Really?
And in 4 days, he managed to flee 160 miles, leaving his army and what was left of it behind him.
Wow.
So needless to say, Congress was no longer enamored of General Gates.
Yeah, right.
At this point, they turned to Washington and said, "All right, we didn't listen to you last time. Now it's your choice. Who do you want to send down south?" And his pick was probably brilliant. He picked General Nathaniel Greene, who was from Rhode Island. He was a Quaker by religion, who of course are opposed to fighting. but they referred to him colloquially as the Fighting Quaker.
Ah.
And he went to the Carolinas, and rebuilt the army, and relied upon another old veteran who came down to help him out, which was Daniel Morgan, who we talked about at Saratoga. We talked about him at the Battle of Quebec.
Right.
We talked about him going through the woods of Maine with Benedict Arnold. And all in all, the two of them had hit upon a brilliant strategy. They knew they had to retake the interior of the state of South Carolina in order to make sure that loyalists didn't sign up to help the British.
Right.
So they split the army, as small as it was, in half. One half, under Morgan, went into the interior. The other half, under Greene, just stayed ahead of General Cornwallis and the main British army, and wouldn't engage in battle because he knew he'd lose.
Right.
Well, at that point, and then the other thing that happened in the South and in South Carolina was a number of partisan groups broke out, one under Thomas Pickens, another under William Moultrie, and probably another under General Sumter, and a fourth one who's probably the most famous, under Francis Marion, also known as the Swamp Fox. And he and his men would live in the swamps. They would come out, they would attack the British, and then they would go back in the swamps, and the British could never find them. So these guys were doing hit and run attacks, hitting the British supply lines, hitting small British detachments, knocking them out here and there, knowing full well that because of the war with the French, the British couldn't send reinforcements.
Right.
So the first thing that happened, the first real victory in the South, happened completely because of a British officer's bragging. His name was Ferguson, Patrick Ferguson. He was a major, but he led loyalists in the Carolinas. And he was so confident that the British were going to win the war that he sent word over the mountains, over the Appalachian Mountains, to the settlers in Tennessee and Kentucky. And he said, submit to the crown, become loyal once again, or I'm going to march an army over the mountains and wipe you out.
Oh, no.
Well, the one thing you don't do is tick off people with rifles who live on the other side of the mountain.
No.
1,000 of them,
no.
or more, came over the mountains. They call them to this day the Over the Mountain Men, and laid a trap for Ferguson. He thought he was well entrenched on a mountaintop. It ended up being a trap because they surrounded him. And they were armed with rifles. His men were armed with muskets. Now, we've discussed this previously, too. A musket has an effective range of about 50 yards. A rifle has an effective range of 300 yards. You see in the picture here?
Rifle wins over musket.
Yeah, rifle always wins over musket.
Yes.
And so the men from over the mountains started picking off Ferguson's men from a long distance before his men could even shoot back. They essentially wiped them out. Of the 1,100 men who were on that hilltop, 300 plus were killed, including Ferguson. And the other 800 were made prisoners and forced to march over the mountains, where they were held in captivity on the other side. Well, Cornwallis could not afford to lose 1,000 men. He only had 8,000 men altogether.
Right.
So he's already down to
7,000, right.
Meanwhile, some of his loyalist troops are starting to go home because they don't like the way things are shaken out here. Because while they're gone, all these other American forces, the partisans, are attacking their homes and burning their properties. So they feel they have to go home and defend their property and their family.
Right.
So they're leaving. So his troops are dwindling by the day. Then he gets wind that Daniel Morgan has a small contingent of soldiers moving around the Carolinas to bolster morale and to increase recruiting into the Continental Army. So he takes his most loyal cavalry officer, Banastri Tarleton, and sends him after Morgan. Now, Tarleton is interesting because as a young captain, it was troops under him that captured Charles Lee in 1776.
Really?
And then he also went on to do a few other battles in the South that, shall we say, were less than honorable. So they called him Bloody Bannister. And he saw Morgan as an opportunity to wipe out that branch of the army. What he did not count on was Morgan. Morgan was an old Indian fighter who'd fought in the French and Indian War. He started his service as a teamster, which meant he drove wagons.
Okay.
And he was on the Braddock expedition, which of course resulted in a disastrous defeat for the British in 1755. Well, a British officer insulted him.
Oh, no.
And here in the colonies, people didn't know their station. Morgan decked him. That was a criminal offense. In fact, it was a death sentence for most people.
Oh, no.
He was sentenced to be whipped with the lash 500 times. That normally would kill a man.
Okay.
Morgan later joked that they only got 499 because the guy couldn't count. But he survived.
Really?
And he survived with a hatred for the British that would last for decades. So what Morgan did was he knew Tarleton was coming for him, and he wanted Tarleton to come for him. So he came up to a hill, and he put his most experienced troops at the top of the hill. In front of them, he put his next most experienced troops who had seen a little bit of action, knew what to expect when the British attacked.
Okay.
And then in the very front line, he put his most inexperienced militia. And he said to those guys, I want you to get off 2 shots. Then you can run back and fall back behind the more experienced guys. And he said to the more experienced guys, I want you to get off 4 shots. And then you can fall back with everybody else behind the very experienced troops. It became a bloodbath.
Oh, boy.
Because a lot of the militia had rifles, and they just hammered the British. And the British thought, supremely confident, that they could just attack head on, and the Americans would flee and leave the battlefield, because that's what militia had always done in the past.
Right.
Well, this disciplined approach that Morgan used completely defeated them, pretty much wiped out this 1,100-man force. So now you've got another 1,000 men that Cornwallis doesn't have. He's chasing Greene all over the place. Morgan leaves after his major victory at the Battle of Cowpens. The previous victory were the Over the Mountain men. That was the Battle of Kings Mountain. And Greene and Morgan link up, so now Greene's got a pretty good size army, and they're experienced. They've beaten Britain before. And at that point, Morgan is suffering from a lot of health issues because he was older than most of the other generals at the day. And so he retired to Virginia. And Greene decided to have one last battle at Guilford Courthouse. And while the Americans yielded the field, they pretty much ended Cornwallis's army's ability to function as a freestanding army.
Right.
And Cornwallis ended up abandoning the Carolinas, going to Wilmington, North Carolina to resupply. And then he marched up to a little village in Virginia called Yorktown.
Okay.
And that's where he camped out, waiting for supplies and more men from the British in New York. Once he was gone, then Greene and the other partisan units concentrated on wiping out the little posts all around South Carolina.
Okay.
And by the end of the war, 1783, they had effectively recaptured all of South Carolina and all of Georgia and whatever part of North Carolina had been taken. Meanwhile, Cornwallis is up at Yorktown, and the French have arrived in Newport. Almost 6,000 French soldiers.
Ooh.
And so Washington meets with their commander, Rochambeau, and wants to attack New York City, And Rochambeau says, I don't think that's a good idea. You know, they got this British army down there at Yorktown. If we bring in the French Navy, that keeps the British Navy from saving them. And then we march down together and besiege them and get them to surrender. That's the second British army who Americans will have captured. First one at Saratoga, this will be the second. And that's exactly what they did. They maintained cover, they maintained deception, and the entire 6,000-man French army came down. 9,000 Americans came down. And then the French Navy arrived, and not only did they bring ships and beat the British ships in the Battle of the Chesapeake, but they offloaded another 3,000 French soldiers. So now you're looking at
Really?
10,000 French soldiers,
Okay.
9,000 American soldiers, and the British have 6,000 men.
6,000?
They're surrounded. And every day, the French siege lines and the American siege lines are getting closer and closer and closer. And finally, in October of 1781, the British have to surrender because they can't get supplies from New York because of the French fleet. They can't get reinforcements from New York because of the French fleet,
Right.
and they're trapped. And so in October of 1781, at the conclusion of the Battle of Yorktown, British under Cornwallis surrender, and that essentially ends the war. It takes another 2 years to come up with a peace treaty
Okay.
that everybody agrees to. But that ends the war pretty much in the Americas. There were some skirmishes and small battles, and as I mentioned before, battles in the Carolinas to recapture the South.
Right.
But in the North, the war was pretty much over with. So now Washington had a bigger problem.
What was that?
How do you keep your troops in the field when they're not doing any fighting? They want to go home.
Ah, right.
In their mind, the war's over.
War's over. Let's go home.
One little problem.
What's that?
15,000 British soldiers sitting in New York City. If his army goes home, who's going to stop them from going out into the countryside and raising havoc?
Uh-huh.
So he's got to keep that army together, and they're starting to get dissatisfied.
Oh, no.
We've talked about how supplies were problems throughout the entire war.
Yes.
Well, another problem was the pay. At first, Congress paid the troops rather well, but as money ran tight, they started to issue what were called continental dollars.
Okay.
And continental dollars decreased in value so much that, quite frankly, after the war, some soldiers used them as wallpaper because it was cheap. They were so valueless that wallpaper had more value than these things did. So people would paste them on their walls for wallpaper.
Right.
So at this point, it's 1783, early in 1783.
Okay.
The peace treaty has not been concluded yet. That won't happen until September. Washington is fearful of losing his troops. And what's worse is this time, well, there have been mutinies in the past. They've been a few hundred men, and they were able to control them.
Right.
This time it's the officer corps. The officer corps says, Congress, 3 years ago, you made a promise that you would pay us half pay for the rest of our lives. But we haven't seen a dollar since then. We haven't gotten any pay in 3 years. And unless you start dealing with supplies, clothing, food, and paying us, we're prepared to take the army and march it on Congress. Now, the idea of that was so horrible to Washington. While he empathized with his troops tremendously and knew what they had suffered and gone through, he could not abide having the military threaten the civil governing authority of the United States,
Right.
because that would jeopardize everything we stood for, which was that the civilians controlled the military. So a meeting was called on March 15th, 1783, in Newburgh, New York, which is where the winter headquarters was.
Okay.
Washington had been silent through most of this, so nobody knew where he stood.
Oh, boy.
But he called for the meeting, and the meeting got underway. Horatio Gates leading the way again, always being the less than helpful fellow that he is. And about 10 minutes into the meeting, the door opens and Washington walks in.
Oh, no.
And he walks in and he says, I want to address the officers. And of course, who's going to tell him no?
Yeah, right.
So he starts telling them how he thinks it's a mistake to march upon Congress, and he urges patience. And the guys are still grumbling and stuff, but they respect him tremendously because he is the revolution at this point. He's kept the army alive. He's kept the war alive. He's kept spirits alive. Mm-hmm. So they respect him. They're a little disappointed. But then, whether it was intentional or not, history will never know. But he decided he wanted to read a letter from a congressman in the Continental Congress.
Okay.
And he starts to read, and he's stumbling over the words.
Really?
So he reaches into his coat pocket, and he pulls out a pair of reading glasses. And he says, "I beg your indulgence, gentlemen, but I have not only grown gray in service to my country, but almost blind."
Oh, no.
At that point, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. I don't think anybody even listened to the letter. They said, you know what? If he sacrificed all this, who the hell are we to complain about not getting paid?
Yeah, right?
And he completely diffused the whole thing. And then wisely sent a letter to Congress the next day. He said, "I saved your backsides this time. I'm not sure I can do it again.
Yeah, right?
You guys need to pony up at this point and put some real hard cash on the table." So they came up with a different plan. Instead of offering half pay for the life of the soldiers, they said, "We will give you 5 years' pay up front, and you can have your choice of cash or securities." And that calmed everything down, and he was able to maintain an army long enough until the British finally evacuated New York in November, 2 months after the peace treaty was signed, on what is still called Evacuation Day. And they left New York, and Washington was able to come in triumph, leading his army. Later, after a few days of rejoicing, and Washington met with his soldiers.
Okay.
And he, with his officers in particular, and he said, "We're going to bid goodbye to all of you gentlemen, because my intent is to ride to Congress and tender my resignation, because there's no need for my services anymore." And so at Fraunces Tavern, which still stands in New York, you can go there and visit, on the second floor balcony ballroom, he greeted all of his officers one by one. They embraced, they shook hands, they had a drink or two, and then he rode off to Annapolis, Maryland, which is where the Continental Congress was meeting. Mm-hmm. They decided Philadelphia was a little too, shall we say, risky to meet in, since the British captured it so easily.
Right.
So they were in Annapolis, and he rode in, and he did something that has been rarely done in history. A military man at the peak of his power surrendered his commission and went home as a civilian.
Really?
This was so radical an idea in history that when George III heard of this, and Washington being his biggest adversary,
Right.
said, "If this is true, he's the greatest man in the universe." And it was. And Washington gained so much respect that when he died in 1799, the British Navy lowered its flags to half-staff. What does that tell you about how much respect this man? He could have had anything he wanted, and he went home.
Wow.
He went home. So,
Wow.
to me, that is the postscript to the American Revolution.
Absolutely.
So-
You're right. You're right. Hey, we've got some photos we want to take a look at.
Sure.
Let's take a look. Take a look and see what we're looking at.
This is a picture of Van Steuben training the soldiers at Valley Forge.
Okay.
He's a fascinating individual because he didn't speak English very well. The only thing he managed to master in English really well was swear words. So, and he could swear in multiple languages. He swore in German, he swore in French, and he learned to swear in English.
Okay.
He learned to swear before he was able to give commands in English, so he had to rely upon an aide. and he would give him the commands in French, and he would translate them to English.
Okay.
But it worked.
Right.
He turned the place into an army, so.
Let's see.
This is a picture of Washington interceding at the Battle of Monmouth.
Okay.
He has relieved Lee of his position now, and now he's taking command of the troops, and he completely saved the day. I mean, he single-handedly turned this battle from an American defeat into an American victory.
Right.
This we're actually going to talk about in the next part of our program. We're going to talk about the war along the shoreline.
All right.
This hat belonged to Captain Phineas Meigs, living in East Guilford, which is now Madison.
Okay.
And he fought in one of the last battles of the Revolutionary War when British troops and Loyalist troops landed in Madison near Fence Creek. And he led the militia to get them off the beaches. And in the firefight that happened, Captain Meigs lost his life. He was 70 years old. And if you see there are two holes in the hat,
Yes.
the one on the left just happened because of old age.
Mm-hmm.
The one on the right is the one that was caused by the bullet that killed him. He was shot in the head, the only casualty on the American side from that battle.
Wow. Let's see.
And his hat is at the Connecticut Historical Society.
Oh, is it?
This is Major John Andre. He was the British officer who was conspiring with Benedict Arnold to convince Benedict Arnold to go over to the British side and to surrender West Point. Benedict Arnold had asked to be placed in command there, knowing full well he planned on turning it over to the British. Fortunately, the plot unraveled before he could do so. Major Andre was caught in civilian clothing and was convicted and hanged as a spy, in no small amount as payback to the British for Nathan Hale.
Ah.
This is General Charles Lee.
Okay.
While he was in captivity in New York, he wrote a letter to Washington and asked him if it was any way possible that Washington could send his dogs to him, because he needed their company greatly, being a prisoner of war. And Washington obliged, and that's one of the dogs there in this
Really?
cartoon.
Oh, wow.
But he was a real animal lover, and difficult with humans, great with animals. There's our friend Benedict Arnold,
Aha.
the hero of Saratoga,
Yes.
the hero of Quebec, the hero of the Battle of Lake Champlain, and probably the most notorious traitor in American history. And then we didn't talk much about the war out west.
Okay.
But the war out west was a fascinating conflict because it involved troops from Virginia traveling over the mountains, down the Ohio River Valley, and chasing the British out of what was basically Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois.
All right.
The Americans came through like a whirlwind and captured most of the major forts along the way, all the way to the Mississippi River. As a matter of fact, they were at the Mississippi River when the British sent a small group down to recapture one of the forts at Vincennes, Indiana. George Rogers Clark, the older brother of William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame, led troops from the Mississippi River back up and forced this fort to surrender, and he captured a whole bunch of British prisoners and sent them back and forced the British to give up their claim to Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And when the peace treaty was signed, all of that land became part of the United States, and British relinquished their claim to it.
Wow.
But to get there, his men had to march through swamps in February. And this is a depiction of them walking through swamps, bundled up, soaking wet, moving through the area to get to Vincennes, Indiana, so that they could seize the fort and toss the British out once and for all. And then this is a vest that we will also cover in our next installment, where we talk about the British attacks on Connecticut. But this is the vest that was worn by Colonel William Ledyard at the Battle of Fort Griswold in September of 1781.
Oh, okay.
In September of 1781, the British decided that to try to draw Washington back,
Yep.
they would launch a major attack on New London, which was a haven for privateers. And so they picked Benedict Arnold to lead that expedition now that he was a British officer.
Ah.
And so
Okay.
he landed half his troops in Groton, half in New London. They burned New London. The fire got out of control and burned most of the city. The other troops on the other side landed in Groton and marched up to Fort Griswold, which still exists today,
Right.
commanded by Colonel Ledyard. When the fort finally surrendered, he offered his sword, which is the way you surrendered back in those days.
Okay.
And the British soldier taking that took the sword by the handle, because you always handed it handle first, and drove the sword right through Colonel Ledyard, killing him on the spot. That is his vest. Again, is with the Connecticut Historical Society. And if you look closely at it, you'll see the entry point on one side and the entry point on the other side where the sword went right through him sideways. His sword, by the way, is located here in the Bill Memorial Library, just a few stones throw away from Fort Griswold and the monument there. So
Really?
you can actually see his sword, and you can see the damage that his sword did to his vest at the Connecticut Historical Society.
Wow.
So
All right. So we have some time left. What else do we want to? What else do we want to talk
we
about?
can start talking about the.
Where do we want to? Where do we want to
We
go?
can talk about the battle along the shoreline.
All right.
So these I'm going to need my glasses only because it's tough to memorize all these dates.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
the first attack by Britain in Connecticut happened on August 30th, 1775, when a British ship called the HMS Rose went to Stonington, Connecticut, looking for cattle and pigs, because the British Army at this point is in Boston, and they're besieged by an American army, and they need supplies.
Right.
So the only place to get supplies is elsewhere in the colonies. So the British sent this expedition down. Well, they expected the Americans to just turn over this food to them, and they would sail away, and they were sadly mistaken.
That's not going
The
to happen.
militia turned out in Stonington and mounted such a successful defense that the British gave up
Okay.
and sailed away. So not only did the British attack Stonington in 1812, in the War of 1812, but they attacked it during the Revolution too. So
Wow.
the next big raid was probably the biggest incursion into the state of all. It happened in April of 1777. And it was when a group of British soldiers landed at what's now Westport and marched inland to Danbury.
Okay.
Danbury was a major supply hub for the American Army.
Really?
And because of that fact, the British wanted it destroyed. It was led by a gentleman named William Tryon, who had been previously the royal governor of North Carolina.
Okay.
But when he was chased out of North Carolina, the British made him royal governor of New York. And so when the war broke out, they made him a general, and he led loyalist forces all over the place. And he led this invasion of Danbury and a Danbury raid. You've probably heard of Sybil Luddington, a young woman from the Danbury area
Okay.
who was, I believe, 16 years old and heard that the British were coming. And while her father was gathering militia, she rode 40 miles to alert the militia in all directions so that they would come and help repel the British. She rode 3 or 4 times the distance Paul Revere did, but didn't get any of the credit that Paul Revere did. So.
No, of course not.
But eventually there were enough Americans to repel the British, although at quite a cost. A lot of Americans were killed, including American General David Worcester from New Haven, who was a fascinating individual.
Okay.
He'd served during the Revolutionary War earlier, but now he was a militia general, and he was shot and killed at the Battle of Ridgefield. Benedict Arnold was home on leave, so he came out of quote-unquote retirement or leave, and led troops at the Battle of Ridgefield.
Oh, wow.
And as a matter of fact, that was the battle that finally got him promoted to Major General. He had been a brigadier general up until that point.
Really?
And was mightily ticked off because he'd been passed over and watched men with less seniority get promoted to Major General.
And not him.
And not him. And remember, we're talking about a man who fought in Quebec, went through the Maine woods leading up to that battle, built a navy on Lake Champlain and destroyed the British.
Yeah.
And now he's done this. So Congress finally, I think Washington sort of shamed them into finally promoting him to Major General.
Right.
And he was a Major General when he fought at Saratoga and in that campaign. So at any rate, he was involved in that battle as well. The other sideline, which was not an attack on Connecticut, but an attack from Connecticut,
Okay.
occurred about a month later when Connecticut soldiers, under a colonel with the best name of anybody in the Revolutionary War, his name was Return Jonathan Meigs. And the story is that while his mother was expecting,
Okay.
she and his father had an awful fight.
Oh, no.
And he stormed out of the house, and she begged him to return, Jonathan, return. And they passed the name on to their son.
Gotcha.
And you would think Meigs, they had a connection to Madison because
Right.
there's a
Meigs Point?
Well, interestingly enough, there's a Meigs family that's still in Madison. And
Oh, is there?
many people always assume that Meigs Point was named for them.
Right.
But an interesting thing happened when they were launching this attack. They were sailing from New Haven, and they were going to come up the coast to where the Sound gets closer to Long Island, so that they had less of a trip under open water. And so they needed a place to put in because the weather got really bad and the ships wouldn't be able to make it
Really?
across the Sound. Because in those days, what they used for ships were whale boats,
Okay.
which were giant open rowboats. Well, if it's raining, what happens to your rowboat? Fills
You get
up.
wet.
And it fills up.
Right.
And then it sinks, and you don't make it across the Sound.
No.
So he had to find a place to put in. Now, this is a great bone of contention because the people in Guilford insist that he put in at Leeds Island.
Okay.
But that doesn't make any sense because Leeds Island was heavily populated, had a lot of farms, and no guy who's running a secret mission is going to park his men for 2 or 3 days in an area with that many people.
No.
Because loose lips sink ships,
Exactly.
literally.
Right.
So what he did was he continued up the coast till he got to what's now Hammonasset State Park.
Okay.
Hammonasset was empty. Nobody was farming that because it's sand or swamp.
Okay. Right.
So he figured that was the perfect place to lay low. So they turned their boats over and used them as shelters and just hunkered down for 2 days till the storm passed.
Okay.
And then they left from Hammonasset Point and sailed across and did an amazing job. They attacked Southampton, they attacked Sag Harbor, brought back 90 prisoners.
Okay.
Returned Jonathan, got a sword from Congress because they were so appreciative of his war effort. And in their own way, Connecticut extracted revenge for the Danbury raid.
Wow.
The interesting thing is, contrary to popular belief, Meigs Point is not named for the Madison Meigs family. It's named for Colonel Meigs because that's where he and his troops camped out. Before
Really?
this, that was known as Hammonasset Point, and it's been known as Meigs Point ever since. So
Wow.
now you know the story behind the naming of Meigs Point.
Wow. Holy cow. All right. So we have about 30 seconds left, but before we say goodnight, you're speaking in April, I believe. Where?
April 22nd at the Henry Carter Hall Library in Clinton on
time?
Route 81, 6 p.m. And we will be talking about the year 1776 and we cover the military aspects and the Declaration of Independence.
Okay.
So
David Levasseur, thank you for some time, my friend.
thank you.
We'll see you soon.
Absolutely.
All right. On behalf of David Levasseur, I'm Pete Mezzetti. Thanks. Good night. We'll see you next week.